Hi, welcome to Inside View. I'm Cory Burnell, and this is our third episode of 4 with our U.S. Representative, Tom McClintock, Congressman. Again, thank you for your time.
Again, thank you for having me.
All right. Well, if you viewers haven't seen the first 2 episodes, do go looking for them on YouTube. You should be able to find us pretty easily there. And thank you for joining us this third time. So on this episode, Congressman, we're going to talk a little bit about fire risks, things that are that's top of the mind awareness right here in California, of course, your district, and also the power shutoffs that we experience with PG&E, regulatory environment that may impose that. So let's talk a little bit about the history of why we experience fires so frequently today. If you've got some I know you know the story very well. You've been our congressman for a long time here.
Well, it's not altogether complicated. Excess timber will come out of a forest in only one of 2 ways. We either carry it out or it will burn out, but it will come out of the forest. We used to carry out the excess timber. We sent foresters into the forest every year, U.S. Forest Service foresters, to mark off excess timber. We then auctioned that timber off to timber companies that removed it and actually paid us to do so. 25% of those revenues went right into local communities like ours, and the other 75% funded the U.S. Forest Service. We had a thriving economy as a result of that here in the mountains. Many jobs. I think there were about 160 plus mills in the Sierra. There are like 20 some odd today. Wow. All those jobs are gone. We've seen an 80% decline in excess timber harvested off the Sierra since 1980. And we've seen a concomitant increase in the amount of acreage destroyed by fire. When we managed our forests, not only did we have a thriving economy, we also had healthy and resilient forests. But then in the 1970s, we began passing laws that made the removal of excess timber endlessly time-consuming and ultimately cost-prohibitive. And the result is timber harvesting stopped, for all intents and purposes. As I said, declined to 80%. Yeah. And now we have a forest that is horribly overgrown. It's estimated we only now harvest about 15 to 20% of the growth of a forest every year. Now, I want you to think about that.
Not 15 to 20% of the forest, 15 to 20% of the growth. Okay.
The annual growth. Now, if I were to deliver 5 newspapers to your doorstep every day, and you only threw away one of those newspapers, how long would it take for your house to become a fire trap?
Right.
Well, that's exactly what's happened to our forests. They've been consigned to benign neglect by radical environmental laws that have made scientific forest management cost prohibitive. And we're now dealing with the result. I saw Gavin Newsom, or it was Jerry Brown, say this is the new normal. No, it's not the new normal. It's the old normal reasserting itself. Before we scientifically managed our forests, we lost between, I believe the figure was 3 to 12 million acres a year to catastrophic fire in California. When we established the Forest Service, started managing our forests, and our wildlands, that number came down to about 250,000 acres lost to fire throughout the last half of the 20th century. What we're now seeing is the old normal reasserting itself. An untended forest is just like an untended garden. It will grow and grow and grow until it chokes itself to death. And in that crowded state, it becomes the trees are stressed. They fall victim to disease, pestilence, drought, and ultimately catastrophic wildfire. And once that happens, it takes a forest centuries, literally centuries, to grow back. The reason we have a U.S. Forest Service is because we decided we don't want to wait those centuries. We want these forests to be healthy and vibrant so that every generation can enjoy them. That's why we have a Forest Service. And the Forest Service has been prevented from doing its job by the radical left and the environmental laws that they passed in the 1970s and refused to modify now. We did get one slight modification for the Tahoe Basin. That was my legislation. It was signed into law in the Wynne Act by President Obama in 2016. And what it did was to streamline those regulations. It specifically provided a categorical exclusion from the National Environmental Policy Act for forest thinning projects in the Tahoe Basin. What that did was to take a project that would normally require 4.5 years to study and permit. They can now bring that within about 4 months. Instead of 800 pages or more of environmental reviews, they have about a dozen pages of environmental review.
Wow.
And that law is now producing the biggest thinning project in history in the Tahoe Basin. And that's critically important because the Tahoe, like the rest of the Sierra, is carrying about 4 times the timber load that the land can support.
Yeah, let's remind our viewers what a healthy forest should be. What, about 80 full-grown trees
exactly
per acre? Okay, and where are we at right now throughout California?
We're at close to 300 average in the Sierra right now.
Okay. Wow, so now the legislation that you successfully got enacted to remedy this problem for the Tahoe Basin, was that before or after that catastrophic fire they had up there a few years ago? Burnt down.
That was the Angora fire. That was in 2007. That was a wake-up call.
Okay. Yeah.
And by the way, by the standards of say the Camp Fire, this was a tiny little thing. The Camp Fire was about 50 times bigger than the Angora fire. You can imagine how that would devastate the Tahoe Basin, or for that matter, any region where it destroyed. And of course, we saw it destroy the town of Paradise and take 80 human lives with it.
Let's talk about, okay, so that was even a smaller catastrophe in the Tahoe Basin. What are some of the ingredients for the success of getting that legislation passed? I mean, it was during the Obama administration. Was it because it impacted both California and Nevada?
Well, actually, I wanted to have that legislation affect the entire U.S. forest system.
Yeah.
And that's the way the bill was originally written. We had to compromise in the Senate because of opposition from the left to have it only for the Tahoe Basin. Now, I have since introduced legislation, now that we have this as a dramatic success story,
example, sure,
to extend that same law throughout the rest of the forest system. Unfortunately, with the Democrats in control, I can't get a hearing on that bill, even though we had broad bipartisan support, 4 years ago now.
Wow, that's incredible. Well, of course, we have fires throughout California, not just in the Sierra. I know they're not your districts, but are there some problems that need solving there in order for
yes,
can you
again,
speak to
it gets
those?
right back to these radical environmental laws. I mean, it's either brush or timber that's burning.
Right.
Timber we've talked a lot about, but we also had very extensive brush suppression policies in place. We could treat acreage with herbicides. We could run sheep and cattle over it to keep the brush under control. Well, those environmental laws have stripped our ability to do much of that. And the result is we now have, on the public lands in particular, these huge, well, I'll give you an example. The King Fire was about 6 or 7 years ago now. That was the fire that threatened to burn into the Tahoe Basin. It was mainly in El Dorado County. I will never forget, and Placer, never forget going to the command center the day that fire absolutely exploded. I've been to a lot of command centers, way too many command centers on these fires over the years. And in every other instance, the firefighters were in control of things, not their first rodeo. The fire might be out of control, but the firefighters were perfectly in control, knowing what to do. This was the one time I didn't see that. This time, these guys were scared.
Wow. And
I will never forget one of the senior guys coming up to me and saying, Congressman, I can't even get to this fire on the ground. We used to have good timber roads. I could get equipment out there. I says, all I can do right now is drop stuff from the air and pray to God the wind shifts. And fortunately, his prayers were answered. Otherwise, it would have burned straight through into the Tahoe Basin. But 4 or 5 years after that, if you go look at those lands today, it burned on both public and private acreage. You can now tell exactly what the property line is between the public lands, which are subject to all of these laws, and the private lands, which are left to good management. You can tell where the property line is just based on the conditions. On the public land side, nothing but, it looks like a giant put black toothpicks next to each other all the way through the 40-foot black toothpicks.
Wow.
And there's about 3 to 6 feet of brush now built up there.
Yeah.
On the private lands, all of the fire-killed timber has been removed. There are new, young, healthy, growing trees. Brush has been suppressed, and you can tell the property line just based on the condition of the forests. I remember a few years back, the head of Alert Tahoe, the group that puts in the fire detection cameras that give us early warning of fires so we can get on top of them before they explode out of control. He said the 2 greatest impediments that he faces getting these cameras positioned so that they can save our forests are the National Environmental Policy Act, a federal environmentalist law, and the California Environmental Quality Act, a state environmentalist law. Those are the biggest impediments to putting in the cameras to save our forests. Now, there's something desperately wrong with that situation. We have had these laws in place now for 40+ years, going on 50 years now. They were all imposed with the promise that they were going to improve the conditions of our forests.
Right.
I think after 50 years, we're entitled to ask, well, okay, how are the forests doing under these laws? And the answer is appalling.
That's fascinating. Now, can you speak a little bit to how public lands and private lands are treated and regulated differently under these laws? It would make perfect sense that private lands, private sector can do some different things, but yeah, give us a little bit more color on that.
Let me give an example that I actually saw in practice from the air, touring the footprint of the fire. When a tree is killed by fire, it usually does, the needles will burn, but the tree itself is intact and salvageable. It still has enormous value for the next year or two. After that, after about a year, the value declines dramatically as the tree rots, as insects take over, and so forth. On the private lands, they can immediately go in and salvage the excess timber, the dead timber, immediately. That generates revenue for them to then plant new trees. On the federal side, it takes about 1 to 2 years to get the environmental impact review done. By the time that's done, the tree's lost any of its value. So you put it out to bid, nobody wants it. So what happens? Those trees just stay there. Now, on the private lands, they can suppress brush growth. On the public lands, they can't. So then you have about 3 to 6 feet of brush built up very quickly. Trees don't reclaim a destroyed forest. Brush gets first claim on that fire-destroyed land. So now what happens? A few years pass, none of the excess trees have been removed, the dead trees. You now have about 3 to 6 feet of dry brush, and those big dead trees that have been sitting there rotting begin to fall over on top of that brush. Now you have dry timber on top of dry brush, a perfect fire stack for a second-generation fire, and when those things come through, they sterilize the land, and you've got nothing but scrub brush land into the foreseeable future. On the private lands, they suppress the brush, they can sell the killed timber and can plant new trees, and within a few years you have a young, thriving, healthy forest again.
So our laws actually put more stringent environmental constraints on the public lands.
Yeah. And as you know, the federal government owns a substantial amount of the land area of these counties. In fact, in Alpine County, I believe they own about 93% of the land in the entire county is federal government land. And the federal government has become a very lousy landlord or gardener.
You're right.
And that's a huge problem. And by the way, the federal government continues to acquire more and more land when it can't take care of the land it already has. Meanwhile, when it acquires that land, it takes it off the local tax roll, so it's no longer producing tax revenues for our local communities. There are usually very, very stringent activity restrictions on it, which means it's not producing income. And yet the left wants to gobble up more and more land. Well, they already own more than 40% of California, actually 48%, I believe.
It's public land.
And, yeah, and that percentage is much higher in counties like ours.
Wow. Now, let's talk a little bit about how these past fires have now impacted delivery of electricity in the state of California, where utilities find themselves liable for fires, and in order to protect themselves, they now are shutting off power at various times. Is there credence to their complaint that they've been unfairly, constrained and restricted from managing their
Not really, because they've
areas?
been willing accomplices. And I, where do you begin? Well, we've talked about the forest condition. I mean, that's the underlying problem. We have tinder boxes now because we haven't managed our forests competently in nearly 40 years. That's the fundamental problem. You've got tinder brush, you've got fires ready to, a forest ready to explode into fire. That's a serious underlying problem. But then on top of that, once again, you go back to laws imposed by government. In California in particular, PG&E has had all sorts of mandates placed upon it for wind and solar power. Well, there are two problems with that. Wind and solar power is the most expensive way we've ever invented to generate electricity. It requires enormous amounts of capital that's paid for by you and me as ratepayers. That capital, if it had not been chasing all of these green energy programs, would instead have been going into upgrading transmission lines, fireproofing transmission lines, so that you wouldn't have to worry about a windy day. So that's one issue. On top of that, you then have the severe shortage of electricity caused by these green energy mandates. We just went through a heat wave with a series of blackouts where in the hottest weather of the year, they turned off everybody's air conditioning because they didn't have enough electricity to go around. Why? Now, the same heat wave hit Nevada and Arizona. They did just fine. In fact, they sold us power. We're the only state that had any problems. And the reason for that is because when the wind stops blowing, the windmills stop producing electricity. When the sun stops shining, the solar panels stop producing electricity. They are extremely unreliable. They are extremely expensive. And then on top of that, you still have to keep ready reserves running under them for the moment when the solar array stops producing electricity or the windmill stops producing electricity. It's an integrated grid, which means you've got to match the power being drawn from it with the power going on to it. Otherwise, that grid collapses. So what happens when your solar and wind stop generating? You've got to be prepared at a moment's notice to put on additional power onto that grid. How do you do that? Well, hydroelectricity is one of them, but they've stopped us now from building dams for an entire generation. What's the other way? Gas-fired turbines. The gas-fired turbines still have to run. They run it at in a state called ready. I forget the term now, but they have to keep turning those turbines to be ready at a moment's notice to switch them over to electricity. So you're still burning the gas, you're just not getting any electricity from them. Ready reserve is the term I was thinking of. So they're run at ready reserve. You're paying for them to run at ready reserve, but they're not producing any electricity until the solar and wind power stops producing it, and then it's replaced, which creates an enormous irony if you think about it.
Yeah.
This state has committed itself to the biggest investment in wind energy of any, as far as I know, any jurisdiction in the world. And it has created the irony that the state with the greatest commitment to wind electricity cannot deliver electricity on a windy day because we have got to shut it down because of the transmission lines.
You can't make this stuff
Yeah.
up. I actually was reading an article when the rolling blackouts had just come through, and the commissioner, I don't remember if he's the energy commissioner or whatever, but he was literally quoted as saying, "We were doing just fine until the wind stopped."
Yeah.
And I thought, is this a banana republic? Where am I? Am I in Central America or South America somewhere where we don't have power because the wind stopped blowing?
Well, and in a heat wave, of course,
Mm-hmm.
the wind doesn't blow. That's what makes it a heat wave. It stagnates there. And then the sun goes down, just as people are getting home and ramping up their air conditioners. And then the sun goes down and the solar arrays are not generating. And then what do you have happen? People watch their food rot in their refrigerators while they swelter without air conditioning.
Well, you know, we hear this mantra of wealth inequality from the left and income inequality. Now, who really gets harmed by these things being turned off? People on fixed incomes who their AC is off now and they're elderly. In addition to those who can afford, those who have the means, go out and get generators. And so there's an additional expense on the middle class to go get their own power.
Or they just get fed up and move.
Which, in all cases, the less fortunate are left less fortunate.
Oh yeah, as Arthur Laffer once said, there is nothing more portable in this world than money and rich people. And they just leave. Yeah.
Very, very well put. Well, now, federal involvement on these topics, obviously we're not going to see new legislation unless the House were to change and the Senate stayed the same here in November, but is there anything from an administrative standpoint out of the White House and federal agencies that can be done, that's being discussed?
Well, everything that can be done is being done.
It is, okay. Can you speak to some of those
Well, I mean, I've
items?
had a number of conversations with the president on this, and he clearly recognizes the danger to states like California by bad forest management. Unfortunately, you know, the state government also plays a role in that, and the state government's completely out of its mind. But on the federal lands, yes, they're doing everything but they cannot go around the environmental laws that require these massive studies. They can try to consolidate, they can try to expedite, but ultimately, you know, they're still bound by the law, and until those laws change, we're not going to see the kind of improvements on our forests that we desperately need to restore them to the health and vibrancy and vitality that they had before these laws were enacted in the 1970s. David Bernhardt is the Secretary of Interior. He has jurisdiction over the national parks. Sonny Perdue, Secretary of Agriculture, over the national forests. They both clearly understand what dire condition our forests are in, but their hands are largely tied by the laws that they are bound to.
Yeah. Now, you're mentioning these federal laws that are in the way. So when California has to buy power from other states, it leads to the notion that perhaps there's a solution with, if there were more power-friendly states, maybe things could be put in place there.
Well, yeah,
that
except
power.
when they just went out on the market to buy the electricity, they were buying it 10 times the normal rate.
Right.
Now, guess who gets to pay for that? You, John Q. ratepayer, in your next bill will see that.
That's right.
Now, it is so self-destructive. And then you go back and you realize we were on the verge of basically limitless electricity. Hydroelectricity, which is the cleanest, cheapest way of producing. We were building hydroelectric dams all across the state. Nuclear energy, again, zero air emissions for both hydroelectric and nuclear. It was supplying more and more of our power at a fraction of the cost of wind and solar. Natural gas, because of fracking. You know, the United States now, under this administration, for the first time in decades, if not centuries, is now energy independent. We export more energy than we import. A lot of that's because of fracking, and which produces natural gas, which has meant that natural gas prices have come way down. So natural gas generation, which does have some air emissions, but a small amount, is now very, very cheap. So what is the government doing? They are discouraging hydroelectric, in fact, obstructing hydroelectric. In fact, the state administration, under Newsom and the Democrats, want to tear down perfectly good dams that currently exist on the Klamath River that are producing electricity. They want to tear those down, will not build new ones. They're tearing down our nuclear power plants. They are refusing to site new gas-generated plants, and in favor of what? The two most expensive ways of producing electricity, massive public subsidies to wind and solar, which we're now discovering are not only cost prohibitive, they are also highly unreliable.
Well, and they're highly pollutive when it comes to mining those rare earth
Oh, good
minerals,
point.
which principally done in China. We know their record on
Well,
environmental.
and again, don't
pollution.
forget, they also don't relieve us of the need to still have gas generators. The gas generators just
There you
aren't producing anything. They're spinning at ready reserve in anticipation of the next cloud that passes over a solar array, for example. And we didn't even get to the cost of transmission. Wind and solar have to be transmitted on different kinds of lines than our conventional electricity, which means you've got to, and in many cases, nobody wants to live near a windmill or a huge solar array. So you have to build transmission lines.
Wow.
You have to build a separate transmission system for wind and solar as you have for conventional. So you're paying twice for the transmission lines. You're paying twice to keep conventional power at ready reserve, and on top of that, you're paying for the most expensive technologies of producing electricity in the first place. This is completely insane. This is the energy policy that is destroying California, and by the way, it's at the very core of the Biden energy plan for the country. They made that very clear at their convention. It is an integral part of the New Deal. Mm-hmm. They want to make it not only so that you suffer in California, but you can't alleviate that suffering by moving anywhere else in this country.
Wow. Well, another excellent episode, Congressman. Thank you very much. Yeah, I know. We've got so much to talk about. It'll go by fast. Folks, thank you for joining us on this third part of 4 episodes with Congressman Tom McClintock. And stick around for our next one. Our 4th one will be on the coronavirus and federal actions regarding that. So, again, I'm Cory Burnell. Thank you.